operations bigger than that. Of the 4 main vineyards we have planted, we're tasting 3 tonight. So I guess from my point of view, the big difference with these over most is that I managed to get some private growers to, support what I wanted to do, and I paid them plenty of money, and we got on pretty well. I found that by the time I got to 1986, I really wanted to plant my own vineyard because I felt that it was so important to get a vineyard on as close as possible to all the same soil and rock and the same aspect and all of that. And I couldn't find any to buy, even if I could afford it. So working back to front, the first vineyard I planted was actually Gaia, which we'll taste in a minute. The next was Polish Hill in 1996, and then in 2000 is the Springvale. So to make sure I don't bore you with too much of a detail about my past, that's how it unfolded. So it's a very personal, very focused development where we've made wine, and now we make wine from the grapes we grow from the vineyards that we planted. So Springvale is really pretty much 100% reflection of red loam on limestone. So you can't get any more of a classic soft rock expression of Riesling than this wine.
What's really unique for me about this particular vintage, my sort of take on the mid palate, is this ripe green fruit element, which is definitely playing a big role in it. And it's really gorgeous, because if I'm thinking, I mainly see these Rieslings on release. I remember once you came up and did a dinner with us, and we did, I think it was 10 years of Riesling plus another 20 other Riesling labels, and you stoically worked your way through all of them with us, for which I'm forever grateful. But my overall impression of the Springvale on current release is always this floral, flower, perfume kind of component. And this is very different. This is definitely green melon, green mango, papaya, that kind of thing, which is fantastic. I really enjoy that point of difference. Now, that is a function of the climate for the year, the drought and the heat that's showing that.
Yes. So I think that's it's interesting that the way I see the season is that often, and I tend to think about these wines and wines generally in shapes. I was quite relieved relatively recently, the past few years, to find that a lot of other people do that. I thought it was a bit odd, so I sort of kept it to myself for a decade or two. But what I found is that if you see a shape, which is this, your way is a sort of generosity early and then sort of tailing off, but with this nice minerality, that shape, that profile will shift. And so in some years it's more intense, especially early, and then and in others it'll be more subtle, particularly early. And the shape may, in a cooler year, the shape may get flattened a bit, and in a warmer year get emphasized and pushed up. But you still tend to have that
curve
shape,
gotcha.
from that vineyard. And I think this is quite expressive this year, and you see that flavour early, but it lingers.
Glorious at such an early stage. It's really awesome. It's really great.
Wonderful.
In terms of cellaring, because this is showing so differently as a characteristic this year, is that going to have an impact on how one lays them down?
I don't believe so. And so from my experience, I would say 20 years is fine.
Right.
Perhaps a bit longer with this year, because, it has a lot going for it. But I guess for most people, 20 years is enough. I found more and more that I'm happy with drinking some, wines in the 90s from Europe now out of our cellar. And it's just a lottery, because, that's, in that case, then we get onto a cork discussion, but involves cork. But there are a lot of, early 2000 wines, even of ours, I think, that look lovely now. And while we know that they are absolutely fine if they're going to be cellared well, to go longer, I think somewhere between 6 and 15 years is a lovely time to drink these.
So maybe
So
should we amble across to the Polish Hill now?
let's do that. And happy to take any questions on this, because a Polish Hill, I'm going to have a glass with you.
Excellent.
It seems like a very good idea.
Now, I remember in previous vintages, like especially the one that sticks in my mind is the 2016 being quite aggressive on early release. The word rasp comes to mind, which is, I don't mean it in a negative way, but it had this real rigidity to it and linearity to it. Whereas this, by comparison on the nose, is possibly a little gentler than the Springvale for me on first blush, which again is quite atypical of what I characteristically hang on Polish Hill, 2 years old or a year old.
So you're thinking more subtle than you're expecting, and maybe a bit softer. Is that? I think the first thing. So this is it's interesting to, especially with being led with a comment like that, that I can start for those who don't know. Polish Hill, as I mentioned, I planted in 1996. And the best way I think to describe it is that there was a small batch of vines planted next door. Anyway, it's a Polish settlement where I think the thought was that the soil wasn't good for anything else. So they planted a few acres of Riesling. And it's really quite poor, almost structureless, silty soil on top, with a bit of shale, and then underneath is some gravel. And then underneath that is just big chunks of blue slate. And so one of the reasons I just mentioned about my training, I suppose, is that I did that sort of classic training through, viticulture and enology, and then, worked around and all of that. And the short of this would be that all of my training and everything that I saw in my early years would tell me to never plant there. This is the last place, because the vines are going to be uneven as the roots hit the rock. There isn't a lot of sustenance there. It has to be built up, which is what we did. We put in a lot of mulch, we put in cow manure. We keep building it up, and every vine is different. So every vine, it has to be hand pruned and hand picked, because they're very uneven. So you really have to look at every vine and go, well, that's struggling a lot, so I'll leave less buds. So for that reason, it would be left alone. And when I got to the Clare Valley, I was told there's a few strips of this, and to just stay well clear. So we planted in 1996, following our experience with the fruit next door, which looked amazing if you could get it right. And not overcrop it. And we found we've got smaller berries, yellow colour, smaller bunches, like really obvious. The comment that I made about having it in a fruit plate would be, you wouldn't want to eat them, And there is, I think on the website, I've still got a photo of the two from a few vintages ago that are just chalk and cheese. One's green and medium looking healthy. The other one looks a bit sad. And that is Polish Hill fruit. And I think to some extent, when you taste the fruit, you think, well, sort of, where's that, limey character? And then you get this flavour that just hangs and hangs. And I think to some extent the wine expresses that as well. So to me, this is very much about mid and late palate flavours. So there is a subtlety about this wine early, I think this year, even more than normal. But it doesn't tend to have that real fruit start to it.
Yeah. I love the layering in the back palate.
That's the way I see it.
The back palate has got this profusion of layers, which I think with time, in fact, I'm sure will start to unfurl. It's quite exciting to see where it's at right now. For me as a shifty salesman, it's terrific, because if somebody decides to open this weekend, they're seeing a glorious example of what you do. But in the background of the wine, to me, it seems there's this brilliant acid that's going to reinvent it in the entire wine over time. I think it's just really, really showing well.
Thank you.
I love the softness now, the unctuousness of it now, which is really unusual.
Yeah. I love it now. It's interesting to hear that. And, I hope you're right. After 39 years, we've seen how they develop, and it's fascinating. It's not always a linear development, but
Yeah.
but I'm very happy with this, and I think in general, the better they look on release, the happier I am, because they will always sort of bloom and blossom, but we're always looking for that expression. And what I found is fascinating is if people know the wines from drinking them when they're older, they often have a better appreciation of these wines when they're young.
Yeah.
So there is another benefit in drinking older wines, I think, even if it's just occasionally, that it's often quite enlightening. And it's lovely for me to be able to show people older vintages, even if it's just a taste, because I think their appreciation of this comes up. But having said that, I have people who love to drink this leading into and early in a meal right now, because it's got the balance.
Yeah.
And I think overall, in terms of Grosset wines, one thing that I've always aimed for is balance in a wine, whether at whatever age. And so I'm very happy with this. And I think it has a subtlety, especially early.
Definitely. There's a poise about it, which is really beguiling. It's wonderful.
To develop really well.
You talk about these shapes. For me, there's this sense of height and depth in the wine, which is really exciting to see.
Yeah, lovely. So I don't know if anyone's got
any questions from anybody before we leave the House of Riesling and look at the Gaia?
I've got a few, thanks, Rob, if that's okay.
Yeah, cool.
First of all, Jeff, you made the comment that you don't like to choose favourites amongst your children, and I assume that in the winemaking you treat them sort of fairly equally, except to the extent that one side is different to the other and the grapes might need some sort of different treatment. But is the price difference then just purely driven by brand and demand, or because I assume that you would say that in terms of quality they're different, but the quality is the same. They're both very, very good quality. So what drives the price difference?
Yeah, it's interesting that so the short answer, I guess, would be the yield is quite different. We aim to get 7 or 8 tons per hectare out of Springvale, which is quite a sort of almost an average or a bit below average crop in our region. However, we have quite a few more vines per hectare, so the amount per vine is pretty small. But we would typically get about 5, if we're lucky, tons per hectare out of Polish Hill. So we're always running whatever that is, sort of maybe 30% lower. So the best we can do is to aim for that sort of level. 5 tons per hectare is a great outcome in the Polish Hill vineyard, because the vines are very even. We might get, I don't know, 2 or 3 kilograms on one vine, but the next vine will be virtually no fruit. And that's because of the rock, really, and the lack of, they've got less area to exploit, because the rock, there's nothing it can do. It can only wrap its roots around it. So interesting, if you go back to 1981, and maybe I shouldn't tell everyone this, but I think the Springvale was about $4.50 and the Polish Hill was $5.10 in Australia, which of course is roughly vaguely similar to yours.
Yeah.
But with inflation and taxes, that works out to be about $55, a bit under $60. So the price has actually not changed much over 40 years.
That's exactly where we are at that price point now.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's a good story or not, but it's interesting what can happen. So the answer really is that it's significantly more expensive to produce. And so from day one, I thought, well, I'll just add a premium and hope that people will pay it. And it's probably been more than that. It's probably attracted more attention because it is more expensive. And so I've thought more and more that I don't really see Polish Hill as notably superior. I love the Springvale. It just has that more open sort of generosity about it. And, it's a horses for courses, I think.
There's room for both. That's for certain. Jeff, just before we go to the Gaia, a question about the G110, which caused an enormous flurry. We tried our hardest to entice your cellar door to let us have some, but I understand you were swamped within the day of release. Can you give us a little bit of background about that? Because we'll be nagging you for next vintage.
Sure. Georgie, my daughter, just left, who has been helping me for a few years now, but she's become preoccupied in the law. It's the way this happens. I guess because she studied until she was 26. I guess she needs to go and do that for a while. But she hounded me. I can say this because she's gone. But she's very decisive, very insistent, and because she's worked at the winery, forever during vintage, helping out ever since she was a little kid. She found that, and she mentioned it to me again tonight, that there are 3 main clones that we work with in Riesling, and lots of people talk about clones with Pinot Noir and can talk about them all night and get very excited, but virtually no one talks about clone on Riesling. And clone being, of course, just a subtle variation within a variety. The 3 that we have are really quite fascinating. One is quite intense, but not as fruity. Let's say about 40% of our Polish Hill. And I did wonder, whether that is a contributor, but there is a significant amount in the Springvale now as well, quite significant. We planted this one clone called 110, or it's actually called, Geisenheim, from Geisenheim. And it's just got a number. And so we planted it in this soil and rock profile that's quite different to these vineyards to see. And it's very, very distinctive. So what we thought is, it's a wonderful story, the fact that every year we keep all the clones separate from all of the vineyards, but we've never released a single clone wine. So what we're really doing is going one step further. We love blending the clones on these wines because it helps, I think, with the consistency. So going out on a single clone is quite bold. So you'll get a more distinctive wine that won't necessarily be love or hate, but it will get a reaction.
And globally, is that an unusual thing to do, Jeff? From a global point of view with Rieslings, is that an unusual thing to do?
Yeah, and I should say there that most sort of no in terms of single clone, but yes in terms of that clone.
Right.
So I think people have seen a clone GM198, it's Geisenheim clone. It's sort of lovely, fruity, reliable wines of sort of, except for, say, Yalumba, where they have their own clone. People like Henschke's and others would have entirely 198, but it's known to be the standard. It's a lovely clone. 110 is rare and it's a bit mean and doesn't have that generous fruit.
Right.
But is extraordinarily persistent and just a very distinctive lingering flavour.
There's enormous.
So we bottled that off separately.
There was a private chat question. Sorry, Jeff, I was talking over you. I apologize. There's a private chat question about the laying down of the G110. There's a couple of collectors here with stocks in Oz wanting to know how to handle it, how to approach it.
Yeah. So we gave it more time on lees to sort of add that slightly more creamy texture. So instead of it being this lovely, pristine, sort of linear fruit driven, it's got a few layers of complexity that we thought were appropriate. So this is really, from what we've learned about Riesling, that we thought without overworking this wine, we thought it was a subtle improvement. We think then that a 15-year term with that would be absolutely fine, keeping in mind we don't have the experience. But I would have said 15 years would be a good, maybe 15 to 20 would be a good guide.
Awesome. Well, there's incredible interest in Singapore for the wine. So maybe we can talk to Greg and see if we can figure something out for next vintage for Singapore. It would be fantastic if we could do that.
I think there's already your name on some cartons, and we haven't even bottled it. So yeah, I think you're quite safe there. Absolutely, we appreciate it. I mean, it's wonderful that there's interest. I think you were, as a country, you were the one that sung out. It's just unfortunate that we sold, and I think it's a reflection of the interest in what we're doing up there. So we do really appreciate it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So now, I noticed that there's some notes coming in here. So
Byron's complaining that he's sorry there wasn't magnums of the G11. I don't think you made magnums of the 110, did you?
No, not enough.
Oh, it's because it's his daughter's birth year. Mate, by the sounds of it, Jeff would probably say that it can last those 21 years. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly.
Yeah.
So So he's looking for 2019 magnums. I must remember that. Yes, no magnums on that, but we do have some, Mark, for you in terms of the 2020 vintage.
Thank you so much.
The volume is even less, but I think it's 80 dozen. Right. So we're looking less than 1,000 bottles.
That's awesome.
So the last one we have is the Grosset Gaia 2017, yep. And I'll just pour myself. I happen to have some here.
As luck would have it.
Yeah.
So this is rated number 2 of 32 in the Rail Review for Cab Sav Blends from South Australia. Do you happen to know what number 1 is? I'm always interested in these lists and numbers. And I think you and Hook would have rated that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
That's interesting because it just shows I should be up with that, but I'm not. You'll notice on our website that there's a lovely review by Tyson Stelzer. So that that's sort of hard to miss because it's like larger than life in the WBM. And of course, I don't take any notice of scores ever. Yeah. Just notice next to it happens to be the 110 on 97 as well. We never take any notice of scores unless they're high. Yeah. And I think that's a good policy. Yeah. But his comments were beautiful, I think, on this wine, because sometimes it's seen as a bit subtle, and I would hope that, most of you on the call, in being able to sort of taste this now and just sip and savor and appreciate it.
Well, it's interesting for me because over the years, this wine is so impressive after maybe the 8 or 9 year mark in terms of vintage. There's it evolves into a thing of absolute beauty. It's one of my total favorites from that part of the world. But it takes its time, and if you're impatient, well, that's your loss. You need to just have the forbearance to hang in there. I think it was the 02 or 01 I tasted the other day with friends, and amazing wine. Just waking up at such a at that stage, it's really interesting to see that.
That's lovely. We had a tasting of I think, what is it, the 28 vintages, mm-hmm. With Halliday and a few others some months ago. And probably one of the nicest things, but sitting opposite James Halliday tasting through.
Yep.
He's a pretty serious guy. We were tasting upstairs at Rockpool Restaurant, which is pretty nice in Sydney. And he just sort of stopped for a minute and he said, I would be just very happy to have any one of these bottles go downstairs and enjoy it with some lunch right now. And, it just put it in perspective that that we can debate the better vintages or not out of them, but they looked, two things, they looked lovely, so drinkable, so balanced, so appealing. But I think importantly, they're all pretty slow developers. The 1990 is probably fully developed, but one would assume so.
Yeah.
You're looking the early 2000s, they're drinking really well now.
Yeah.
So it is a slow developing wine. And the other thing I think is that it's the highest vineyard in the Clare Valley. It's cool. It's very cool. It's got a great aspect. It's pretty windy. It's on some pretty tough soil. It's an extraordinary site. There's no vineyards. You can't see any vineyards around at all. And it's just in grazing land. And I think get amazing sort of lingering intensity, but without the alcohol. I mean, we get, might get 14 alcohol, but we never get above 14.5.
And as you pointed out earlier, it's all about balance, right? And even the
Yeah.
high alcohol wines, if the balance is there, it can hold it. I love this unctuous softness, even at this early stage. For me, there's this grainy tannin that's kind of gripping in the front. It has all the components that it needs to travel the next 10 years easily.
Yeah. So I hope people enjoy it. I mean, it's got a bit of red. 17 is just a little bit fresher and a little bit more fruit early. A little bit of red fruit, I think, which is really interesting because I can sort of taste the vintage through that. And to me, it's in a nice way, keeping in mind that it's probably not quite the tannin level of 16 and maybe probably not even of 18 now looking at it. But it's got so much complex flavors. Maybe this will be a sub 20 year. Maybe it'll hit its peak at 16 to 20 years instead of older. But this is an interesting reflection of that year. I think it reflects it really well with that fruit profile.
I mean, my small experience of Gaia as a label has been softly catch the monkey. It's something that just slowly but surely gathers in confidence and stature over the years. It's definitely a wine to have patience with, but it pays off in spades. It really does.
Yeah.
With this global warming, Jeff, have you changed the blending to any kind of extent? Is there anything that's fundamentally changing as the years go by?
Wow. I think it just sort of struck a nerve, I guess, in that I guess many of you will know that about Gaia being Earth Mother, but also being used by an Englishman named James Lovelock, who in late 70s, early 80s, professed that the world, in fact, needs its complexity of species. And if we knock them out, it's like a ball of wool, starts to unravel. And he suggested that the world could, with what we were doing, warm up as much as 2 degrees in 20 years. And he was just ridiculed, I think, in general, early 80s. I found his work pretty profound. I don't want to get into it because it's a bit like, backing the right horse. So he was wrong, fortunately, about the 2 degrees over 20 years, but the trend was quite accurate. So from that, I took a pretty simplistic view. I thought, I just need to plant the coolest site I can find. And that will give me, hopefully, a little bit of insurance, if you like, if it does start to unwind the way he proposed. And what I've found since then is that Cabernet Franc was the right decision to go with Cabernet Sauvignon, but I think not Merlot. I mean, I did try it. Merlot doesn't seem to, works in those sort of, cloudy, those overcast sort of trickier years to give some fullness. We don't want that. We want the bright structure of Cabernet Sauvignon, enhanced by a little bit less tannic but brilliantly fruity Cabernet Franc. That's just a bit less tannic and a bit more perfumed. I think they work wonderfully well together as a shape and a style. But we wouldn't change that now. And it's almost like if there was any need for Merlot, there isn't a need for it now. So we're very happy with Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc. I think it's worked out to be good.
And over the years, maybe the Cabernet Franc will have more and more of a role to play than the Cabernet.
It could do. I think we're around 20% now, and we definitely wouldn't reduce that. I mean, we're 20% in the vineyard. We definitely wouldn't reduce that. We think that works really well. It raises the whole issue of blending, which, is a subtle art. But I mean, it's like talking about the clones with Riesling. I mean, they're all about the subtlety that to be honest, we should sort of sum up and pass on to you as consumers in the shortest sort of sense as possible, because it must, run the potential of boring the hell out of people if we talk about them too much. But it's what we work with. It's having these subtle differences to be able to work with, and just refine expression of a site and variety. It's so important. but it's important to us as sort of like tools.
Yep.
And for Gaia, I mean, there's a risk of sounding like bragging on that, but you know, I'm so happy that the decisions made in 1986 paid off, because not everything I've done, and it would be general, I think for all of us, I would almost be tempted to say, not everything's paid off.
No.
This one was as simple as pick the coolest site and plant it with what I think is the best combination, which is Cab and Cab Franc, and it's managed to work. But it probably took 2 decades to get acknowledgement of the wine.
Any other questions from everybody before we let Jeff go back? Greg's asking, why did you plant Gaia Vineyard? You must have been crazy. Well, I think you were genius. It's the coolest climate, it's the highest altitude, it's getting the very best
I
of
prefer, I prefer your assessment, Robert, if you...
Oh.
I think I'm happy to stick with that. But I think what it shows is that, you know, we, you know, you take your best judgment. I think that this is, I'm sure most of you have done this in whatever aspect of business. You know, you read, you pick up everything you can, and then you run with it. It's just that with us, it can take 10 years or more before you realise whether you've got it right. I mean, I planted Alianico, thought it was great. I reckon I misjudged the change in climate in the Clare Valley by about 30 years because it just didn't ripen. You know, that was, I just had to accept that was wrong, and I just pulled it all out. So, you know, not everything works, but I mean, I am delighted when things do.
There's a question from Deming who's asking, what food would, it's quite an interesting question actually, what food would you have with Polish Hill versus Springvale? Obviously they're different drivers and determine different styles.
I think I had Polish Hill a number of times with oysters, just, you know, Sydney Rock, just plain. I thought it was an extraordinary, you know, combination. We in our spare time go fishing on your peninsula for King George whiting, which is just a lovely white fish, you know, quite subtle, done very simply, like fish and chips, fish straight out and filleted and served with Springvale is just a delight. So probably those two.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming tonight. We'd like to invite you back when the new vintages roll in. It's great to have you here in Singapore, even though you're not with us specifically. I think I'm still hungover from that last Japanese dinner we had 2 years ago with you here in Singapore, but you're welcome back anytime. Please do stop by.
Remember. Thank you. I know it wasn't subtle, but it was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Sorry, there's a question out there.
Yeah, so Jeff, what's the vision for the winery going forward? I mean, what do you see 5 or 10 years in the future as far as your vision of the winery?
Wow. I guess I'll try and answer that in a short, because we even talked about it tonight. The first thing that we are dealing with is climate change. So I won't bore you with that, but just securing water. I had a meeting this morning for the whole region to looking at recycled water for our area. There's nothing special there. Securing water is critical. I think, so it's interesting that a number of people have been experimenting. I don't know if people have talked about it. It might put you off a bit, but with sunscreen, equivalent of like bentonite, which you use for stabilize, just straight natural extract that's put on grapes and vines, like a sunscreen, like if you were going to walk out into brighter sun yourself. There's a lot of work being put into that and making sure that there's no negative impact on it. But in terms of ours, my daughter is fiercely interested, as is my son. And one's an investment analyst, and the other one is a judge supporter. And we're working in a field of crime, which she finds fascinating. So the answer there is that they've got their own careers which I've encouraged them to follow for at least 5 years, because why would you study all this time and not do it? They love it, but they're mad about the winery. So I still feel that there is hope that they'll drift back. So it's an interesting, maybe a personal way to finish, but I think I was offended the first time. I think it was my cardiologist, after saying I was absolutely fine, said, "What have you thought about the future?" And I felt like nearly saying, "Piss off." I don't want to answer what I think you're implying, but that's probably a longish answer to. For anyone who's 65 like me, I'm very happy to continue, and we've got a whole lot of stuff that we are in the middle of and I want to complete. But at the same time, I'm looking at my kids, and they are fascinated and they're really into this, but they've got their own interest at the moment. So hopefully they'll learn and make mistakes and become mature before I want them to come back.
Well, Jeff, there's a whole lot more questions, but I know your time is short. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope we can see you when the 20s come out. We can taste them together again. It was a privilege having you. Thanks once again.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here. Good to see you all.
Good night.
Great pleasure.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.
Safe travels to Finland.
Well, he's going to miss out on the good stuff that we got hidden away.
Yeah,
Robert,
mate,
so
you're going to hold the good stuff for later. It's always
Man,
important.
we've been only drinking your best stuff for the past 3 months.
400 bottles are down to 100, so it's all good. Love your work, brother. That was awesome. Paul. He's an extraordinary presenter, and that's
very cool guy.
Bucket list guy.
Yeah,
and he's definitely love that.
Thanks,
one.
mate.
See you, mate.
Well, I hope we can drink together for